Dear students, welcome to massive open online course on research methodology in history. Today we shall be discussing about Renaissance and historiography. The foundation of modern Western historical writing were laid between the period 15th and 19th centuries. The intellectual and cultural movements and transformation during this period affected a massive change in the patterns of thoughts and practices, and this was naturally reflected in historical writing. This was not a smooth process or rapid process. It was a massive cumulative phenomena involving the contribution and interventions of scholars starting and inventing many new processes and ways of thinking, writing and researching. One of the brightest initial period of this movement was the Renaissance. Therefore, to understand the changes that occurred in historical writing during this period, we need to understand what Renaissance was. The term Renaissance has a long history. In the 16th century, Giorgio Vasari, an Italian historian of the arts, used the term Rinascita to indicate that the arts were being reborn in Italy. In modern times, the famous 19th century French historian Michelet used the term in 1855. However, it was first used to indicate a coherent historical phenomena and period by Jacob Burckhardt in his famous book, The Civilization of Renaissance in Italy, in 1860. Renaissance is used in history to refer to the period between 14th century and the end of 16th century, when a momentous cultural transformation spread through Italy, especially centering around Florence and then through many parts of Europe. This transformation saw the rise of the philosophy of humanism, which tried to put more emphasis in man in contrast to the medieval God-centric worldview. It involved a widespread interest in classical Greek and Roman writers and their works, and saw a brilliant efflorescence of art, literature, architecture, sculpture, philosophy and history. In the new intellectual world of Renaissance, history was accorded a high position, and it was seen as a liberal art, an essential part of education of any accomplished or cultured person. History now became something that was not just widely read, it was widely written. It needs to be remembered that there are specific features in the intellectual makeup of Renaissance that directly affected historical writing. The first important feature was humanism. Humanism gave central importance to human beings and human agency in consideration of society, politics, culture, as well as the creation of important institutions like the state. Another important feature was secularism. This did not manifest in its entirety in the Renaissance period, but we see a gradual, slow movement away from the central place of religion and this unquestioned acceptance of religious authority in all walks of life. The most important feature, according to Jacob Burckhardt, was individualism. Developing directly from humanism's emphasis on human being, the individual was discovered as a distinct conscious entity in itself, and this came to be incorporated in the art and literature, with the artists and writers demonstrating their unique individual styles. There was also the development of realism, by which it is meant that the artists and writers of the Renaissance society tried to depict the world in a more real sense than in the medieval times. Now we have discussed about the specific features of this Renaissance society. Now we will be seeing how these philosophies affected history writing. So we will start our discussion with humanist historiography. History writing principally started in the Italian city-states of Florence with the celebrated historian Leonardo Bruni, and from there it spread outward to Rome, Milan, Genoa, Venice, Naples, etc. Modern scholars have divided this history writing into two phases. First, from the start of the 15th century to 1494, when French invasion of Italy disrupted its city-state system. And the second is after the invasion, the period after this invasion. The principal feature of the first period, or the first half of this period, was civic humanism, with Bruni being a prominent example. And for the second half of this period, we see a rise of the sense of catastrophe. And Machiavelli was a leading representative of this sort of writing. Now, humanist historiography is thought to have originated from two intellectual phenomena that existed before or just at the start of the Renaissance. The first is chronicle writing and the second is Petrarchan humanism. Chronicle writing is an ancient practice that reached its peak in Europe between 14th and 16th centuries. Chronicles in Italy were initially just lists of city rulers, and they soon began to expand as they became medium of expressing civic pride. Thus, past and present eras were compared and more secular informations were included, and some chronicles transcended the spatial restrictions of locality of the city-states to write about broader issues. Petrarchan humanism originated with Francesco Petrarch. His contribution to history was sense of time and his antiquarian activities. He was fascinated about the history of ancient Rome and spent a lot of time exploring and studying its ruins. He wrote about famous men of ancient Rome and thus contributed to history. But far more important was his emphasis on the notion of change of time. He managed to establish that present was fundamentally different from the past and thus for the first time wrote about historical change. Now we shall be looking at the features of this humanist historiography. First, the phase of history writing for the first time managed to convey that past was truly distinct and separate from the present, that historical change occurred and that an examination would reveal a succession of not just historical events but ages and epochs, each distinct from the other. Second, historians writing during the Renaissance were fascinated by the historians of ancient Rome like Polybius, Livy, Tacitus, Sallust, and so on, and they adopted their styles and methodologies. This change in writing also provoked a questioning of the medieval Christian interpretation of human history. Third, the notion of verification of sources and methodology of philological text criticism to accomplish the same was developed during this time. Lorenzo Valla, in his discourse on the forgery of alleged donation of Constantine, managed to show how text was forged through linguistic analysis. Fourth, historical causation. Simply listing of facts and events were no longer enough. It was important to chart out causal connection between them. However, such efforts had not yet reached the level of writing about general causation, but only specific events. And finally, history and historical investigation were assigned a didactic purpose. That is, history should be able to teach and convey moral and political lessons to the present-day readers. This did not mean a compromise with the truth while writing history, but it did mean a selective approach so as those individuals and events of the past most capable of conveying a lesson were selected from historical demonstrations. Now let us discuss about some of the historians of Italian Renaissance. Leonardo Bruni. Leonardo Bruni is considered to be the first humanist historian. His work, History of the Florentine People, is exemplary of Renaissance historiography. Bruni set out three principles for history writing: a long and connected narrative, causal explanation of each event, and public expression of one's judgment. The first volume of this History of Florence is remarkable for its methodological rigor and how convincingly Bruni was able to dispel the mythical origin of Florence and write only on the basis of hard evidence. To Bruni, history was a literary genre with its own distinct methodology and having a didactic and patriotic purpose. Lorenzo Valla, another historian, pioneered the art of text criticism and realistic history writing. His discourse on the forgery of alleged donation of Constantine was a great example of his philological method of text criticism and was very useful for political aims of his patron, King Alfonso of Aragon. He was extremely forthright in his analysis and did not hesitate to even criticize spiritual authorities. After all, the document he was proving to be a forgery claimed that the Roman Emperor Constantine had donated Rome and huge parts of Western Roman Empire to the Catholic Church in 4th century CE. He was able to show that the language used in the document did not date back to 4th century CE, but rather originated in the 8th century when it was forged by the church authorities. His achievement broadened the scope of classical philology and handed the historians a powerful tool. In the field of realistic history writing, Valla added jesters and common people to the narrative and gave them a voice. He abandoned the rhetorical method of history writing of the ancient times, where opinion of the historian was placed as the speech of historical figures. His argument was that history should focus more on depicting fact than advance arguments through rhetoric. While he never entirely rejected the legacy and influence of classical Roman historians, he developed his own language and style. Another important historian was Francesco Guicciardini. He was contemporary of Machiavelli. His principal work was History of Italy, where he discussed the history of Italy from the period of French invasion in 1494 to the death of Pope Clement VII in 1534. This book is specially notable for its strict adherence to critical analysis of sources. Instead of usual contemporary humanist method of using one source at a time, he used a whole range of sources. He was regarded as a peer of ancient Roman historians. However, he himself was very skeptical about the glory of ancient Rome, and he criticized this tendency of comparing everything to Rome. And here we see that importance of a context. For he said that comparison between current and Roman works could only be valid if the current works were born in a comparable city and civilization. He further asserted that the ancients were not a font of infallible wisdom, but rather modern thinkers had innovated various things which had never occurred to the ancients. He stood apart from his contemporaries like Machiavelli in various ways. Unlike Machiavelli, he did not entirely believe that past was uniform, nor did he insist that the study of past made future predictable. He did not think history could have educational value, as he found most of the historical characters to be petty and mean. His treatment of events was not just flat narration, but rather there were attempts to situate them in a larger context so as to make them comprehensible to the reader. Thus, he was quite an exceptional historian. Another important historian of this period was Flavio Biondo. He was both an antiquarian and a historian. While the definition of historian at this time was more connected to the use of rhetoric and politics, an antiquarian was a person who collected non-textual remains of ancient past. Biondo combined both these activities. In his opinion, ancient remains and monuments should be studied in the same way as historical texts, not just as relics, as historical important relics. His notable work was Rome Established, Rome Triumphant, and Decades of History from the Deterioration of Rome. Like other historians writing at this time, he also emphasized the need to separate myth and legend from facts. So, we have discussed about some of the famous Renaissance historians. Now, we shall make a brief evaluation of Italian humanist history writing. While humanist history writing was a vital step forward in the development of modern historical consciousness, it did have its drawbacks. So, what are the drawbacks? First, the focus of all history writing was only on political and military matters, which naturally made for a rather incomplete picture. Moreover, historians tended to ignore areas in which other historians had already worked. This created paucity of content that became an actual problem. Second, the vast majority of 15th century historians were reliant on only one source, which almost invariably was an ancient Roman historian. And it was not until Guicciardini that the practice of using multiple sources simultaneously became a common practice. Third, since history writing was informed by humanist philosophy, the belief in an unchanging human nature became a problem when it came to analyze the past. Also, Renaissance historians believed in a recurring cycle of events while also thinking of history in terms of linear change. Thus, these two models of events occurring existed together, and this could lead to confusion. Next, humanist historians focus on things like rhetoric and prioritized style and grammar over substantial history writing. Instead of critical empirical investigation, they preferred to trust ancient authors. And finally, the vast majority of historians relied on rich patrons and had to portray these families and their ancestors in a favorable light. They generally had to avoid offending the government or powerful elites. So far, we have discussed about history writing in Italian Renaissance. Now we shall go beyond Italian Renaissance and we will study about historical writing in France. The new distinctive ways of writing history slowly spread from Italy to other European countries, including England and France. In France, history writing became a major area of intellectual pursuit in the 16th century. This new historiography tried to fuse legal scholarship with history writing. To them, simply writing about the past or championing the ancient ages, as the Italians had done, was not enough. Their research endeavored to be extensive and broke new grounds. Legal history in France was inspired by Italian Lorenzo Valla's work on Roman law. French historians like Jean Bodin, François Baudoin, Jacques Cujas, Louis Leroy, and Andrea Alciato tried to uncover the original language and form of ancient Greek and Roman laws and also conduct a comparative studies of those laws with legal system of contemporary period. The ideas that came from this project were principally about the distinctiveness of French law from Roman law and how law in general was historically produced according to the unique environment and needs of the people of different states and different times. The second product of this research project was the realization that just like laws, language itself was historically produced and therefore were subject to changes. It was at this time that we see the first attempted distinction between primary and secondary sources in historical research and writing. Thus, ancient Roman historians were seen as primary sources. This realization would further be developed and established as a basic part of historical methodology by German historian Ranke in the 19th century. So, the first historian we shall discuss about is Jean Bodin. Jean Bodin was a historian, a jurist, and a political philosopher. His book, Method for the Easy Knowledge of History, is a major work on historical writing. The chief feature of his work was synthesizing mutually opposed ideas in one work, like the Platonic idealism and Aristotelian empiricism. Bodin disagreed with the cyclic nature of theory and notion that mankind was in constant decline from the mythical ancient age of gold. He argued that in ancient period, man lived in savage, dispersed group in wilderness. There was little education, knowledge or civilization. It was man's emergence from this state and the formation of a well-regulated society that led to gradual improvement of human condition. Thus, Bodin believed in a linear path of gradual improvement throughout history. To him, technological breakthroughs like clock or printing press were evidence that contemporary period was far better than the ancient period. He argued that geography and climate influenced human societies and developed through history. He broke totally with the rhetorical tradition of history writing that had been common among the earlier historians. To him, truthfulness of a historical narrative was far more important than aesthetic appeal. To him, there were three levels of reality: human, natural and divine, and they in turn inspired three types of histories: probable, inhabitable, and holy. An extremely important argument of Bodin was that historians should look beyond Europe and try to write histories of Asia, Africa, and America. Doubtless, he was influenced in this by the geographical discoveries and explorations of the 16th century. Bodin is said to have pioneered a form of historicism when he argued that while reading or critiquing the works of ancient historians, one should take into account the constraints and limitations of the period, not simply read it from the contemporary point of view. With this, we come to the conclusion of our discussion. What we have seen so far is humanist history writing during the Renaissance spanned a significant period and took multiple forms. It occupies a very important position in Western historiography as it is the first manifestation of modern historical writing. Important methods like source criticism or philological analysis, study of context, historicism, distinction between primary and secondary sources made their appearance and were used in various extents by different historians, with notions like the importance of man, linear progress of history, etc., became more widespread and adopted among scholars. History writing in West had left its medieval phase and had decisively created a new paradigm. Thank you.